Hello, my name is SHAZZBARBARIC, reading the Times for Monday, November 8th, 2021. Reading the Times for Monday, November 8th, 2021. We still have to summarize these. Still catching up. I got a little distracted. What I discovered was there's this thing called Discord. And so we're making the political party on Discord so people can join and organize that way. But it's a learning curve. So the last day or two, I've been learning how to set up a Discord server, as they say, a Discord server. And then I'm going to put the link below to the Discord server and start promoting that. We have 50 states with the House, the Senate, the State House, and the State Senate, all in different categories. We have the SCOTUS, we have the POTUS, we have the whatchamacallotus, we have their cabinets, so we can have discussions on each part of the government and where we're trying to promote people. I don't think it's going to be a party. I think it's just going to be an organization tool. Flash politics. What are the values? Let me read you the values. I've been brainstorming this a day or two. I'm acting like I have a boss. You know, I told someone that. They're like, how's the work going? I said I alternate between complaining about my boss and complaining about my employees. But it's just me. Just some days I'm like, oh, I have a shitty employee. And the other days I'm like, oh, I have a shitty boss. But it's just me. All right, here we go. Geez, where is it? I hope I can find it. Well, you know, I'll remember it off the top of my head. There are rules. The 6 rules for joining Flash politics and organizing with us. Rule number 1, be kind. No, that's all. If we don't start there, then we're gonna, just rule number 1, remember to be kind to each other. There's a human being on the other side of the computer. We have to eventually get in person when we talk about this stuff. It's a friendship party. Rule number 2, believe in science, because we're doing this in a scientific manner. Now, science doesn't mean I have the answer, you have the answer. It means that we do things in a scientific method, which means that it's accountable, it's repeatable, and it's open and transparent. Because science changes. And that's the thing when people talk about these cultural discussions that we're having about. I mean, one example, homosexuality was determined to be not genetic. It just kind of blipped in and out of the news because it's such a political issue now. People are like, I'm born this way, this and that. Actually, the science definitively has said, and this is hundreds of thousands of people they studied for many, many years, that you weren't born that way. That it's more complicated than that, and definitely it can't just be assigned as a genetic thing. But since it's a political issue now, they made a website. They kind of said, this is the science, this is our research. And I sent it to my friends when it came out, just like, here's the latest science. It doesn't mean you should treat gay people worse or better. You respect people, and that's why rule number 1, be kind, covers all that. We don't have to talk about identities and transgendered rights and this and that. It's like, let's just be kind to each other wherever you're at in your path in life, and we'll try to respect it. The thing is, when a minority community claims oppression and then claims all the bandwidth in the discussion, and that's why I'm prioritizing. We talk about war because war is where all our money's going. And we're not going to sidetrack that conversation for these other things. I have Obama in one of the speeches he was giving. Someone stood up because when Obama was elected, we elected him to end the wars and prosecute the war criminals, hold the previous administration accountable. And a couple of times people asked him, why haven't you done that, Obama? And he gives these non-answers. I'm looking forward, not backward. He's colluding with them. He was elected to make sure they didn't go to jail. But someone pointed out, they said, why are we talking about these transgender issues when there's so many other things going on in our country? And Obama says, I didn't bring that up. It's not me. Psh. Joseph Biden just created a transgendered commission. Come on, these guys are putting it front and center in order to stoke the cultural debates. And I'm not saying we shouldn't protect people's rights or we shouldn't respect people. I'm saying that we have existential issues that are going to lead to the end of the America, the end of the United States, the end of the world, our climate, war, the big issues, and everything in the other categories has its place within the discussion. I mean, that's why I never really like talking about the color wheel politics. When you talk about black people who are only 10% of the population, but we're not talking about the oppressive systems that promoted racism, which is the economic systems. The economic systems pushed racism so that way they can divide poor white people against poor black people. This has been documented over and over again, that the strategy for promoting racism isn't because they're racist, but because they're greedy. So we have to attack their greed. This is profit generating hate. So without talking about the profit, we're never going to get rid of the hate. And that's why when you look at these Black Lives Matters and you look at their actual agenda and what they're trying to say, they're not going after the profit motive. And so they're never going to get at the root of the problem. People don't hate without a motive to hate. And the motive is it makes really good money. And also when you look at the profit, you realize that there's so many different ways to get people to hate each other. It's not just based off of race. There's a lot of divisions that they stoke. And then you look at the modus operandi of the United States and other countries and you realize we divide and conquer. And we promote different factions in order to kill each other. When we went into Iraq, we pushed the Sunni-Shia divide. That was the plan from the beginning. The CIA was funding militias, which the military then has to go and fight. And you have army officers saying that we don't know who we're fighting, and there's no unity of command because we have our paramilitary, our CIA over here, just giving people money and weapons, and then we have to go and clean up the mess. And that's something I talked about in another video, the break of trust between the soldiers and the mission they were given, which wasn't an honest mission, being undermined by our paramilitary. But this goes back to the profit motive. If we trace the money, if we trace the profiteers, we start to see the mechanisms of control and dividing in our nation. And that is, so we want to deal with systemic stuff, not just with symptoms. How did I get off track? We want to keep this under 10 minutes, the introduction. Well, because flash politics, by just telling people to be kind, we cover that, I think. That's the idea. Just be kind, we cover that. Rule number 1. Rule number 2, trust science, and that's what I just brought up. Science means open, accountable, transparent. Abide by the scientific method, and if we're not right, we will correct towards the truth. And that's what the scientific method does. It's the best method we've come up with for discovering truth. Because if I do an experiment and I get results and then I present them to you, and that's why you trust peer-reviewed journals, my peers are going to review my work and find out discrepancies if there are any, or create a better framework for the knowledge which I acquired. Because you can find knowledge and you can find data, but then someone down the line says, that's true, but, and then they take your knowledge and put it in a better framework, putting new, and we're always doing that. We're always taking science and applying it to like a larger framework that better describes the world, because the world is infinitely complex. And so one answer is never going to be static. So anyway, so science, that's only 2 rules out of 6. I'm really stretching this out. So be kind to each other. Respect science. Number 3, make friends. These all build on each other. So make friends is build relationships. If you're kind to each other and we share values about how we're going to communicate scientifically, if you disagree with someone, do it in a transparent, open manner where you're relying on facts and a certain standard of methodology, the scientific method. So that way we can be friends. And friends can disagree, but when they share values, and then I don't say we disagree because you're a bad person or I'm an asshole or we're just arguing to argue. We are looking at the data differently. Let's agree to disagree. And that's when we disagree. But for the most part, be friends, yeah. And that's when you're in a protest movement, when you're in groups, you go to a concert and you're like, oh my gosh, I know so many people who met significant others at concerts because of shared values. In the army, so many people got married because we matriculated. And then all of a sudden we're in military intelligence. So they know you're smart. They know you're probably from a conservative Christian household or something. A lot of Christians join the army. So you share a lot of values. People get married right away. Be kind. Trust science. Make friends. What are the last 3? The last 3 values were promote solutions. That was the 4th one. So we're solutions oriented. The Marines in their officer training handbook. I don't know if I read this or I just heard it over and over again, but it says don't bring up a problem without a solution. So be solution oriented because we are the ones who are trying to solve this. So we're not going to put this at other people's feet. We're going to do the whole JFK adage, no problem made by man is too great for man to solve. We are not prisoners of our own misfortune. We've created this mess and we can clean it up. So be solution oriented. No matter how daunting the task, there's always something you can do. So we say be kind, trust science, make friends, promote solutions. The fifth one was respect nature. Nature has to be in there. There's human nature and there's outer nature. Outer nature covers the globe. Respect nature means leave the world better than you found it. Respect nature means you don't cut down the tree to pick a couple apples. You nurture the tree, so that way it'll always be there and it'll always be giving apples to future generations. Not literally, maybe we do have to cut that specific apple tree down, but as a whole, respect our resources. Also respecting nature means respect human nature. So when we find out scientifically that homosexuality might not be genetic, respect that. Respect whatever innate nature we are discovering is in the human being. Human beings, and also, I have to look up that. I'll probably link it when I do the reviews for this week, because just because it's not genetic doesn't mean it's not epigenetic. It doesn't mean it's not environmental. And how many of us control our environment we were born into, which is just as much genetic. If you're born into an environment that produces a certain thing, how are you going to blame someone for that? But honestly, I don't really care to talk much about sex. I'll describe my sex life if you want, but other than that, in politics, we should probably talk about economy and other stuff more. That's all just, I think, emotional triggers, just like the abortion and other stuff. Why are we talking so much about people's sex lives? But so with the economy, respecting nature, we create an economy that isn't respectful of human nature. All of this alienation, all of this sitting, all of this dividing people from their families, we, in the winter especially, we go into offices until the sun goes down, we leave. That's not respecting nature. Humans as animals, as a human animal, we should respect that. What is best for the human being as just a functioning whole as a part of this world? When I'm in New York, I tell people, yeah, we have pigeons and rats. We don't have life. We don't have vitality. We don't have, and then people take vacations away from where they live. So that's just a sign that where we live is killing us. It's dirty. It's sad. So that's not respecting nature. So respecting nature was in there just to say, respect what came before the human, right? Don't just live in a world of illusions of our own creation. And people say, oh, we're aliens or we're not meant to be in this planet. We literally came from this planet. The planet peoples. We came from the planet like any other animal, and we can find a place within it. There's native traditions that lived for, their traditions say millions of years. We can document them for at least tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. No, I don't think we go back that far, but like tens of thousands of years in the Pacific Northwest within the ecology. And we've been there for 100, 200 years. We destroy salmon runs. We destroy ecology. We destroy, we're terraforming in the worst ways when there's examples of other human beings who've lived within these ecosystems who are able to coexist within them. They respected nature better. That's wisdom that we need in creating a movement. So we say, be kind, respect science, make friends, promote solutions, respect nature. And then the sixth one, promote peace. Because, like I said, war is the biggest drain on our economy, on our souls. Nuremberg trials, which supposedly the biggest trials of humankind history, our biggest devil that we pull out of history, Hitler, and then all the world came together and said, you are bad, Hitler, and all of you guys who supported Hitler, you guys are bad too. In that big setting of good versus evil, when you bring the bad guys to court, hold them accountable, because it's not good enough, like the United States keeps claiming, to kill them. You have to bring them to court in front of everyone and establish a justice and a historic record if you claim to be civilized, and if you claim that the rule of law and not just the rule of might governs you, which we know it doesn't, but that's what they claim in the story of our civilization. So in that setting, they said war was the greatest crime because it includes all others, a war of aggression. So promote peace, promote the antithesis to the greatest crime, and not just peace without, but peace within. Which is why, if you want to help me on my mission, on my quest to save the world, spread the word. Say, Shaz is over there, and he's doing stuff. and you should listen to him, or maybe you shouldn't. But this is, for the first 10, 15 minutes, he'll talk some crazy shit. And then he'll read the New York Times and, I don't know, mess up a bunch of words and starts to slur. And if he's tired, he probably just mumbles a lot. But the first couple minutes, he might say some cool stuff. So spread the word. Tell someone about me. Number 2, Kickstarter. Kick me $1. No, I keep saying Kickstarter because it says kick. Kick me $1 on Venmo. Venmo. Venmo is at SHAZZBAR. 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 You know what? You can send me 5 cents, 10 cents, 15 cents, 20 cents. You send me $1, you're getting a sticker. You're getting a sticker. If you send me $5, you're definitely getting a sticker. Send me $1, maybe. If I'm not doing anything that day and I'm passing by the post office, I'll give you a sticker. But anyways, Venmo, $1, $5, whatever you got, 1 cent, 5 cent, whatever you got. I have gotten no money from anyone ever. If you give me 5 cents and you're the first person to give me 5 cents, I'm probably going to talk about it. And then reserve my books. And that's why we talked about peace. That's why we say promote peace, because we have a very big elephant to eat, a very large mountain to climb, a huge task ahead of us. So keep your peace. Make sure you're healthy. Make sure you're good. Or else how are you going to be kind to people? How are you going to trust science? Because you'll be emotionally reactive, which is a scientific bias. How are you going to make friends? People don't want to be friends with angry people. How are you going to be solution-oriented if you're not peaceful? Again, you're reactive. How are you going to respect nature? Because, the angry animal he stands out in nature. Have you ever gone to nature and just sat down? It's a beautiful thing. That's why Buddha sits under a tree. All of our wisdom traditions are peaceful men, peaceful women, I think. What's the wisdom tradition with women? Well, that would be in the promoting peace part. Let's look at our oldest wisdom traditions, our spiritual traditions. Where do we find peace? And let's promote those. You can help me promote peace by reserving my books about peace. Goodbarracks.com, GOODBARICS.com, and DaoDeShazz, TaoTeshazz.com, DaoDeShazz.com, Good Barracks. I pay $20-$30 a month for the last couple of years to keep those online until they sell. We'll see if they sell. Okay, 17 minutes, 30 seconds, but I think we got a couple ideas in there. That's why we do that, to get some ideas out before we do this. Now, this is Reading the Times for Monday, November 8th, 2008, as Shaz prepares to go where many boldly have gone before, running for Congress. But first, to audit our narratives. Retailers scramble to attract workers ahead of holidays. Willing retail workers are likely to earn larger paychecks and work fewer hours, while consumers may be greeted by less inventory and understaffed stores. The biggest risk to retailers and distributors is that they're working their current workforce too much, said Scott Mushkin, who founded the financial consultant R5 Capital, based in New Canaan, Connecticut. Overtime can only go so far. The workforce is tired out. Mr. Mushkin experienced firsthand just how eager we retailers are for workers during a visit last month to the Home Depot in Naperville, Illinois. I was looking at a sign listing open positions at the store when I was basically accosted by a manager asked if I was interested in applying. Mr. Mushkin said, "We're coming out of a crisis we have no experience in dealing with, in which millions of people were furloughed or laid off or removed from the workforce. And to think they'll all show up on a certain day to come back to work is kind of silly," Mr. Cohen said. Some people are still fearful about coming back to work, especially in a job in which they would be exposed to large numbers of the public. While fear of the Delta variant may be keeping some workers away, the retail industry has been loath to impose vaccine mandates for fear that store workers might leave and that it might become even harder to find seasonal employees. The challenge of finding workers has put a spotlight on how difficult many retail jobs are, and the short shrift given to many store workers during the worst of the pandemic. For retailers who have treated their workers as dispensable cogs in order to increase their bottom line, to say they are shocked that they can't find people to work for them is hard to believe. Houston officials worried about crowd control before Travis Scott took to the stage. Dupree Johnson arrived for work at NRG Park at 3 a.m. More than 1,000 people were already waiting for the gates to open. A 22-page medical plan prepared by Paradox called for a main medical tent with 2 emergency room physicians, 6 registered nurses, 2 paramedics, and 9 emergency medical technicians, along with people to track and triage patients. The number of people in need of medical care, which grew to more than 300 and possibly many more, appeared to overwhelm those resources even before Mr. Scott began performing. People usually fall and you just pick people up, he said, recalling his experience attending the Astroworld event in previous years. This time, people couldn't do that. There were too many people. You couldn't even move. Everywhere people were pushing you. Every time he performs, people get excited. Mr. Scott managed to get through another song before he paused the music again. We were like, people are passing out over here. We have like piles of people. He could not hear us. It was too loud. A security guard guided Mr. Hassan and his friend away from the stampedes via the VIP lounge and out into the street. Witnesses to the end. The crowd at the gate didn't know it, but the Marines had been told to close it at 6 p.m. That left just 30 minutes for Captain Jeff Ball, 33, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines Ghost Company, to pluck out a few more people with that elusive combination of affiliation and luck that would get them onto a plane out of Afghanistan. He said goodbye to his pregnant wife and deployed to Jordan with Ghost Company in April, and his green sea bag filled with 40 books, including Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. On the night of August 12th, Captain Ball, called 6 by his Marines, was on a training exercise in Jordan when he received a text from his gunnery sergeant. Captain Ball returned to base to the news that Ghost Company of the 2-1, as the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines is known, should be ready to deploy in 96 hours. Captain Ball turned to 1st Lieutenant Sam Farmer and yelled, "Get your platoon! Get them into the crowd and push them back!" The 41 Marines of Ghost Company's 1st Platoon tried to provide a barrier. On top of that, the Marines were inundated with phone calls and text messages from senators in Washington, D.C., Afghan war veterans in California, news organizations, and nonprofit groups, all trying to get vulnerable Afghans through the gate. Some of Captain Ball's Marines dragged him back to Abbey Gate, and he cleared the tear gas from his lungs and eyes and ran back to help. She died with COVID. Should her organs have been donated? It's a tough ethical question. If the patient assumes the risk, should we do it? Disease transmission is always a concern when organs are transplanted, but there's a tremendous demand for life-saving organs in the United States and a limited supply. Organ recovery practices vary widely from one center and region to the next, influenced by local availability of donor organs. Abdominal organs below the diaphragm, like kidney or livers, are recovered for transplantation even if donors test positive for the virus, so long as they were asymptomatic, said Dr. Franklin of the Organ Procurement Association. Many people waiting for organs are deathly ill. If their lifespan may be down to a few days, if they don't get a transplant, they will not survive. Physicians with yet another group, the American Society of Transplantation, said they would not procure any organs from any patient who has shown sign of illness and has a positive test for the infection. If a deceased donor may have had long COVID and tested negative for COVID, the organs would be taken, Dr. Kumar said. If we start turning down everyone who has had a COVID test in the past, we'd be turning down a lot of organs. A recently updated report by the Committee of the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network summarized the evidence about organ recovery from donors with a history of COVID. One concern is that patients who receive transplanted organs are usually required to take medications that suppress the immune system to prevent rejection, of the organs. To steer China's future, Xi is rewriting its past. In the build-up to this week's meeting, articles in People's Daily, the party's main newspaper, have praised Mr. Xi as a core leader defeating the pandemic and other crises. Mao led the country to stand up against oppression. Deng brought prosperity. And now Mr. Xi is propelling the nation into a new era of national strength, said the stage-by-stage description of modern China's rise that is laid out in the party's documents and is likely to be enshrined in the resolution. Mr. Xi's conception of history offers an ideological framework which justifies greater and greater levels of party intervention in politics, the economy, and foreign policy, said Kevin Rudd, a former Australian Prime Minister who speaks Chinese and has long meetings with Mr. Xi. For Mr. Xi, defending the Chinese Communist Party's revolutionary heritage also appears to be a personal quest. The resolution will present the party's 100-year history as a story of heroic sacrifice and success. A drumroll of preliminary articles in party media indicates Mr. Xi sees history as a tool to use against the biggest threats to Chinese Communist Party rule, said Joseph Torgian, an assistant professor at American University, who has studied Mr. Xi and his father. The new resolution is likely to praise both Mao and Deng, while indicating that only Mr. Xi has the answers for China's new era of rising power, said Susanne Wegelin-Schwerdrich, a retired professor at the University of Vienna, who studies the party's use of history. What's in a name for the Koreans of Sakhalin and anguished history? A South Korean law took effect this year, allowing more of Sakhalin's Korean diaspora to return to the ancestral homeland, a monument of long-delayed redemption for a people brought here as laborers 3 generations ago, and then left stateless under Soviet rule. The public art school has a Korean department where some of the performances are based on North Korean songbooks, but with altered lyrics. Many people are really quarreling because of this, said Sergei Lee, a 33, a bank employee who volunteers distributing Korean groceries to older members of the diaspora, paid for in part by a South Korean foundation. Sakhalin Koreans have campaigned for years for the entire diaspora to have a right to claim South Korean citizenship. While people of Korean descent live all across the former Soviet Union, Sakhalin Koreans consider themselves a separate group, with a particular legacy of forced resettlement. South Korean lawmakers hesitated bestowing special rights upon Sakhalin Koreans, and even when the breakthrough came last year, thanks to influential lawmakers from the majority party sponsoring new legislation, they still imposed strict limitations. I'm trying to slow down a little bit because I want to make. I listen to these, all of them at least once over. So when I speak, I do listen, and then I think, all right, how can I do that better? This is practice in public speaking as well as reading the news. But yeah, so I try to improve. Afghan military pilots on the run feel abandoned by U.S. We believe in the U.S. military and government that they would help us and get us out of this situation, said the pilot, a lieutenant, who, like other pilots in this article, spoke on the condition of anonymity because of security concerns. General David Hicks, a retired Air Force officer who's the chief executive of Operation Sacred Promise, said the group, formed in August, has received desperate messages from stranded pilots asking whether the U.S. government had a plan to get them to safety. Safia Ferozi, an Afghan Air Force squadron commander who was evacuated to the United States with her husband, also a pilot, and daughter, said she had been inundated with panicked calls and texts from Afghan pilots in Afghanistan and Tajikistan. We feel abandoned, but we still have hope the U.S. will help us, said a major who said he had piloted numerous combat missions. We are fed up. We're getting weak. I'd like to request that the U.S. government expedite our situation here. During Afghanistan's collapse, about 25% of the Afghan Air Force's aircraft were flown to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, according to an October 31st report by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. The Taliban have said there is a general amnesty for any Afghan who served in the former government or worked with the U.S. government or military. Veteran U.S. diplomat comes under criticism for a trip to Myanmar. Mr. Richardson's latest visit last week made him the most prominent Western figure to meet with Myanmar's generals since they overthrew Miss Aung San Suu Kyi's elected civilian government in February. The state-run media in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, published a photograph of Mr. Richardson and General Min Aung Hlaing together in a grand hall, Mr. Richardson in a chair and the general perched on an ornate golden sofa. Phil Robertson, the Deputy Asia Director for Human Rights Watch, said on Twitter that the trip did zilch, zero-nothing for human rights in Myanmar while giving a propaganda win to Burma's nasty, rights-abusing military junta. Pathetic. In an interview, Mr. Richardson acknowledged that it was possible that his visit had given the junta an air of legitimacy, but he said that his goal had been to focus on the needs of Myanmar's people. Mr. Richardson said he had not raised the case of Mr. Fenster during his Myanmar trip because the State Department had asked them not to. A U.S. Embassy spokesman in Yangon, Myanmar's largest city, declined to say why the State Department had asked Mr. Richardson not to raise Mr. Fenster's case. On February 1st, as the generals were seizing full power, Mr. Richardson called on Miss Aung San Suu Kyi to step aside and let others lead Myanmar's pro-democracy forces because of her failure to promote democratic values. This may have made the regime more amenable to his visit. Nicaragua descends into autocratic rule as Ortega crushes dissent. After methodically choking off competition and dissent, Mr. Ortega has all but ensured his victory in presidential elections on Sunday, representing a turn toward an openly dictatorial model that could set an example for other leaders across Latin America. No one will elect anyone because only one candidate is Daniel Ortega. Mr. Ortega's path to a fourth consecutive term in office and near total control of Nicaragua has ushered in a new era of repression and terror, analysts say. A recent poll showed that 78% of Nicaraguans see the possible re-election of Mr. Ortega as illegitimate, and just 9% support the governing party. The leader of one electoral watchdog group, Olga Valle, left the country after Mr. Ortega's government began targeting anyone who spoke out against it. The first aspirational candidate to be targeted was Cristina Chamorro, Nicaragua's most prominent opposition leader, and the daughter of the woman who unseated Mr. Ortega in 1990 after his first stint in power. Ortega's mask is off, said Miss Valle, the wife of the imprisoned opposition leader. On tiny Guam, it's one dog catcher versus 30,000 strays. No matter how many hours he works, no matter how elusive he is at the Animal Control Office, he faces an inescapable reality. On this island, there's just one Nicholas Ibanez, and at least 30,000 stray dogs. In the animal control room, Mr. Ibanez looked through the photos of pet dogs with bloodied legs and one that showed a stray baring its teeth at a toddler as she stood on her doorstep. We get hospital reports about stray dogs biting kids, even elderly people. Back in the day, he continued, I used to be able to walk to the bus stop without getting chased. The island has struggled with stray dogs for decades. The dogs proved so smart and elusive that the authorities eventually resorted to planting poison, said Cyrus Lure, president of the board of directors at Guam Animals in Need, an animal shelter. The island's divisions have crept into Mr. Ibanez's daily work, forcing him to go on capture missions in the dark of night to avoid the small number of animal rights activists who have taken to heckling him and scaring him away and scaring the strays. You have to deal with a lot of people's emotions when you have to remove the animals, or emotions when you see an animal sick or dying or abused, he said. Fears of wider instability in Iraq after attack on Prime Minister's home. Iraq's Prime Minister survived a drone strike on his home early Sunday, Iraqi officials said, raising fear of wider instability after disputed results in Iraq's parliamentary elections. Iraq's President Barham Salih described the attack as a prelude to a coup, tweeting that we cannot accept that Iraq will be dragged into chaos and a coup against its constitutional system. On Friday, tensions over results of the October 10th parliamentary election came to a head after a clash outside the Green Zone, the site of the executed leader Saddam Hussein's former palace grounds, where the U.S. Embassy and many other Western diplomatic missions are. Mr. al-Assad, let's real quick. How many employees do we have in Iraq right now? How many U.S. officials work in Iraq? $2,500. Those are combat forces. How many State Department officials? Well, the State Department has over 24,000. No, plus that, 70,000. It would be interesting to look this up. I wonder how many employees do we have operating in Iraq right now? Directly under the State Department, directly under the President. That's something to look up when I do the review for the week. Find out just how many forces we have over there. Not just forces, but bureaucrats trying to run the country. Or influence it, right? We don't run Iraq. We just leave people there to protect our interests. And they just happen to occupy the former dictator's grounds. Where the U.S. Embassy and many other Western diplomatic missions are. Mr. al-Sadr, whose fighters battled American forces during the U.S.-led occupation of Iraq, is viewed as an Iraqi nationalist with an uneasy relationship with Iran. An American State Department spokesman, Ned Price, called the strike on Sunday an apparent act of terrorism that was directed at the heart of the Iraqi state. Although Mr. al-Kadhimi said both he and those who work with him are fine, the Iraqi military command said that several guards were being treated for injuries. Mr. al-Sadr, whose movement has won the highest number of seats of any political bloc in parliament, described the attack as an attempt to return the country to the control of non-state forces, to make Iraq live under riots, violence, and terrorism. Iranian-backed groups that have previously threatened Mr. al-Kadhimi condemned the drone strikes. Abu Ali al-Aqsari, the nom de guerre of one of the leaders of Kataib Hezbollah, a main Iranian-backed militia, accused Mr. al-Kadhimi of playing the role of a victim and said that no one in Iraq considered the Iraqi leader's home worth losing a drone over. Ooh, burn. You ain't even worth losing a drone over, bitch. NYC rats, they're in the parks, on your block, and even at your table. According to experts, exterminators, and city officials, the perfect pandemic storm scenario behind the surge goes like this. When restaurants closed, rats had to scavenge outside more. A few months after the city shut down, construction, which drives rats into the open and had been halted like everything else, returned with a gusto. In a lawsuit filed last month in a bid to block the permanent expansion of outdoor dining, a group of city residents cited the structure's rat appeal among the objections. In Bushwick, the fourth-ranked neighborhood in rat sightings this year, Anjali Krishnan said that one of the most disgusting things she had seen was a moving garbage bag going down the street and realizing there's a rat inside. The craziest was someone stepping on a rat, Miss Krishnan said in an interview at Maria Hernandez Park, where rodents could be seen hustling around near the bushes as people enjoyed games, music, and food. Stuffing dry ice into burrows is one way the city is now fighting the war on rats. We're going to see about deploying these rat traps throughout the city, Mr. Adams said in an interview. High schoolers barred from hockey games after crudely taunting a goalie. During a hockey game last week between the Armstrong Riverhawks and the Mars Fighting Planets, a number of Armstrong Senior High School students began chanting, "Inappropriate and abusive language." That was their chant. "Inappropriate and abusive language" at the Mars goalie, according to the Pennsylvania Interscholastic Hockey League. Kirk Lorigan, an Armstrong High School principal, told the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that the students who led the chant had been subjected to appropriate school discipline, but he did not specify exactly what actions were taken. In addition to barring Armstrong students from attending games, the league also required the school to provide a faculty member or administrator to attend every home game and away game in order to monitor and report any inappropriate behavior. Armstrong is the only school in the league currently required to have a faculty member in attendance. The Armstrong Area School District issued a formal apology to the Mars Area School District and said it would be apologizing to the goalie as well. According to Mark Gross, the Mars District Superintendent, "We are confident that the Armstrong Area School District's efforts will lead to appropriate discipline for those involved, while also minimizing the potential for further incidents," Dr. Gross added. 2,000 pages and pronto, budget scorekeeper are under pressure. In the case of the Build Back Better Act, the formal name of the social spending plan, the budget office's staff must consider a 2,000-page bill with effects throughout the economy. Former budget office director said such small seeming changes can often lead to major revisions in estimates. The budget office has been working alongside Congress on the legislation for months, considering various proposals and advising congressional committees on how various policy tweaks might influence the cost of different provisions. The budget office dashed those hopes Friday. According to aides, its staff told lawmakers it would not have a full estimate for the bill for a few weeks. Now, the president of the American Action Forum emphasized that the budget office would not serve Congress well if it cuts corners or guessed about the policies where it could conduct rigorous estimates. The budget office has constructed a computer model that evaluates the effects of public policy on health care insurance rates and spending. Republicans basking in Tuesday's victories diverge on what comes next. Although majority of the speakers at the annual conference of the Republican Jewish Coalition were effusive with their praise of the former president and spent much of the two-day gathering citing his administration's most conservative policy achievements, others warned that Republicans who continue to give cover to his baseless claims about fraud in the 2020 election were jeopardizing the party's recent success. The most notable Trump skeptic was former Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey, who urged Republicans to promote a plan for tomorrow, not a grievance about yesterday, and said the party would be making a grave mistake if it did not recommit itself to truth-telling. Still, like many other top Republicans who have offered their analysis of the country's suddenly jolted political landscape, Mr. Cruz indicated he believed the poor public perception of President Biden and the Democratic Party were enough to guarantee Republican success. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, who is frequently mentioned as a top contender for the Republican 2024 presidential nomination, should Mr. Trump decide not to run, thundered against what he called a Faucian dystopia, a reference to the government's leading infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is a proponent of the kind of public health mandates and restrictions on everyday activity that many Republicans have opposed. Mr. Trump has warned that Republican voters wouldn't show up at the polls unless the party's elected officials embrace his lies about voter fraud. They're just going to lose because the public doesn't want to see that. In addition to Mr. Christie, other Republicans who urged his party in unambiguous terms to get past Mr. Trump's false claims and repeated instances of being cheated of victory were Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire. Who wants to hang out with Eric Adams in Puerto Rico? Everyone. 3 days after winning the New York City's mayor race, Eric Adams arrived in Puerto Rico, a conquering hero basking in his element. Henry Garrido, the leader of major public workers union who sparred with Mr. de Blasio over the vaccine mandate, said he believed the new mayor would be more collaborative because as a former police officer, Mr. Adams has been a city worker and a union member. Democrats don't want to disband the police departments. They want police officers to do their jobs. Democrats are not against closing Rikers Island, but they also want to close a pipeline that feeds Rikers Island. Still, Mr. Adams and many attendees were more often in a celebratory mood, taking stock of a city council that will have a majority of women for the first time and embracing a sweeping infrastructure bill passed by the House late Friday. Earlier in the day, Mr. Adams had insisted to reporters that he was not involved in the speaker's race and it would be decided by the 51 members of the city council, though nearly everyone at the event was debating whom he might support, and there are ways, overtly or implicitly, that he or his allies might influence the process. I'm just excited about the makeup of the council, young, energetic, with a lot of ideas, Mr. Adams said, adding that seasoned electeds like Julie Menin, a veteran city commissioner and the city census director, and Gail A. Brewer, the Manhattan borough president who is joining the council, would help guide the group. At a fundraiser for the Brooklyn Democratic Party, Mr. Adams also defended himself from criticism that he was spending time with the city's elite at the Manhattan nightclub Zero Bond. I don't think it mentioned it, but I kind of glanced over this article. It also said something about him loving his Ferragamo loafers. So he sounds a little bit like a fancy mayor. They just elected a fancy mayor. Yeah, it's a good job. But at least he's black, right? What happens if the Supreme Court strikes down New York's gun law? New York State has one of the most restrictive gun laws in the country, sharply limiting people's ability to carry weapons outside their homes. Legal experts said that it is likely that New York will have to replace its current law with a less restrictive one that would allow more people to carry guns in public. We're likely to see New York be forced to rewrite its law, said Adam Winkler, a law professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, who specializes in constitutional law and gun policy. While most guns used in shootings in New York City are not owned legally, research has shown that the vast majority of crime guns are often purchased illegally in states with less restrictive laws and smuggled into the city. New York's concealed carry gun law, the Sullivan Act, was first adopted in 1911 in response to a deadly rise in gun violence in public spaces. New York City has experienced a marked increase in homicides and suicides by gun violence at the turn of that decade, and Mayor William J. Garner had been shot in the neck in 1910 in an assassination attempt in New Jersey. Astroworld victims included high schoolers and college students. A brother, Julio Patino Jr., said his younger brother was planning to pursue a career in biomedical engineering and had a particular interest in prosthetics. The brother of Danish Baig described him in a Facebook post as a beautiful soul who put everyone before himself. I am scarred for life, said the brother. Basil Mirza Baig. Axel Acosta, 21, was identified on Sunday by his brother, Joel Acosta, as the man in a photograph circulated by the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences in Texas, which was seeking the public's help to identify the man. From there, Axel Acosta rented a car and drove about 90 miles south to Seattle before flying to Houston for the music festival, his brother said. During the concert, Axel Acosta got separated from a person he had been rooming with at the local hotel, his brother said. Madison Dubisky, 23, attended the festival with her brother, Ty Dubisky, the Houston Chronicle reported. Can we separate the art from the artist? It came on the radio, and my sister, only a year older but centuries cooler, told me, this is the greatest song ever. It's impossible for me to hear that song now without thinking of her. When Patricia McLean, Don McLean's ex-wife, hears American Pie, she isn't reminded of golden moments of adolescence or even the classic age of rock and roll memorialized by the song. Gary Glitter's Rock and Roll, more popularly known as the Hey Song, for instance, was pulled from the airplay after the musician was convicted of possession of child pornography and a series of sex abuse offenses against young girls. In other words, the problem with American Pie isn't the song. The track's racist lyrics, which refer to slave ships and rape, have been controversial since the song was first a hit in 1971, the same year as American Pie. And yet the guitarist Keith Richards, when asked about the removal, seemed a little uneasy with the decision. I'm trying to figure out with the sisters quite where the beef is. Didn't they understand this is a song about the horrors of slavery? There are a lot of things I revere about Brown Sugar and Mr. Richards' guitar riffs, not least, if the Stones don't know why the song has to go, does simply removing it from their tour sheet go far enough? For a lot of baby boomers, it's painful to realize that some of the songs first lodged in our memories as adolescents really need a second look. This is a story of how Lincoln broke the U.S. Constitution in April 1861. When the Civil War began, Lincoln was thoroughly committed to the compromise Constitution, which he endorsed and embraced for his whole political life. Unlike his first two violations of the Constitution, which came quickly, Lincoln's movement toward emancipation was agonized and slow, precisely because he knew that emancipation would have the effect of destroying the core of the constitutional compromise he had pledged to uphold. Lincoln had already transformed the Constitution from a political compromise into a platform for defending moral principles by invoking its authority to end slavery. Even before Lincoln broke the Constitution, some of the most sophisticated thinkers about the nature of the Constitution were attuned to the complexities of the question. Of course, the moral Constitution, made possible by Lincoln's defiance of the Constitution of 1787, has too often been thwarted. The reality is that Lincoln's moral Constitution, like all constitutions, is not an endpoint, but a vow of continuing effort. How to buy nothing new this holiday gifting season. My husband lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. We met in New York, and now we all live in Vermont, where the poster ended up too. Every new purchase puts into motion a global chain of events, usually beginning with extracting oil to make the plastic that is in everything, from stretchy jeans to the packaging they come in. In her book, Consumed, Asia Barber, a sustainability and fashion industry expert, writes about the perpetual disappointment of Black Friday shopping that ends in buying merchandise you haven't seen before and didn't especially want, but somehow felt compelled to buy because of the low cost. Certainly tasking myself with finding a gift that speaks to my rich and complicated relationship with my partner, rather than simply shopping from a wish list he has shared with me, requires more thought and work. There are 2 resale shops that specialize in children's clothes and toys, a community closet filled with free clothing, books and baby gear, 3 buy nothing groups, a consignment store, 2 used book groups, several vintage and antique stores, and a quirky boutique with a resale section. Swapping new for used doesn't actually reduce the drive to consume. J.P. McKinnon, the author of The Day the World Stopped Shopping, How Ending Consumerism Saves the Environment and Ourselves, told me, "For me, finding ways to replace new with used feels more like a treasure hunt than an obligation." The way we work now, or don't. One of capitalism's enduring contradictions is that it fosters a value system that teaches us to find meaning in our work, while employers' relentless pursuit of profits ensures that millions of people must earn their livelihood in jobs that are degrading, underpaid, and physically and psychologically exhausting. Current economic circumstances are enabling workers to push back against employers to obtain higher wages and better working conditions. Farhad Manjoo's column was a thoughtful analysis of Americans' disillusionment with a hyper-focus on work. Self-driving cars, trips to space, the first trillionaire. The media's determination to laud the often ridiculous activities of these lucky few has become socially damaging, and I feel an assault on the aspirations of ordinary workers. It's time for radical changes in working conditions. Many more people are now asking themselves what, where, and how they will perform work. After the flood, it's not just about the coming back. Forever competing with high-end stores at the mall at Short Hills, Main Street business owners are reevaluating their models and insurance plans as fears of more frequent flooding grow in Ida's wake. GoFundMe pages popped up. Governor Phil Murphy visited the next day with Tim Sullivan, the chief executive officer of the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, who called the state's small business owners resilient as hell. They announced a pool of $10 million in emergency funds, and business owners could apply for grants up to $5,000. 4 days after Ida, he hosted a pop-up called Ida Rather Be Open. Clever. Ida Rather Be Open. Addresses changed overnight, and owners got creative. Jumana Culligan, the owner of Paper, Ribbon, and Wrap, lost her gift shop, but was able to move on from her lease to the basement of the book house, where she knew the owner. 2 blocks away, Miss Sedlecki relocated to a vacant storefront and advertised flash flood sale. Said Mario DeMarco, the owner of the restaurant Basilico. 1 month after Ida, store owners who applied for relief grants from the town received an email from Steve Grillo, the executive director of the township's new Special Improvements District. Why media loves child labor now. No, not child labor. Why the media loves labor now. A tight labor market has also shifted leverage toward workers. The planned revival of the chief is one of a handful of indications that, at the moment of political turmoil, economic change, and a pandemic-driven focus on how we work, labor has become a hot news beat. That's evident in the new energy of the niche publication Labor Notes, a strike wave, and Payday Report. Stephen Greenhouse, a former labor reporter for the New York Times, told me that for a time in the 2000s, he was the only full-time daily labor reporter. Now there are at least a dozen legacy outlets and digital ones like Vice and HuffPost. John Schluch, the president of the News Guild, a union representing newsroom employees at the time, and other news outlets across the country, told me that the effect is not necessarily sympathy, but a deeper understanding. The new brand of labor journalism runs the gamut from conventional newspaper reporting to outright advocacy, and the most ambitious news entrant on the scene hails unapologetically from the Bernie Sanders stream of class-based American politics. More Perfect Union, a nonprofit news outlet that quietly started in February. The labor media surge has come with some eye rolls from the journalists who were working the beat before it was cool. Chip shortage creates new power players. The most visible beneficiaries have been giant chip manufacturers like Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which offers services called foundries that build chips for other companies. The shortage has also sharply bolstered the influence of lesser-known chip makers such as Microchip, NXP Semiconductors, ST Microelectronics, onsemi, and Infineon, which design and sell thousands of chips varieties to thousands of customers. Above all, the chip makers are asking clients to share more information earlier about which chip they will need, which helps guide decisions about how to lift manufacturing. Many chip makers for years sold largely interchangeable products and often struggled to keep their factories running profitably, particularly if sales slumped for items like personal computers and smartphones that drove most chip demands. Mr. Morthy said the company had managed to produce more chips in its 3 main factories in Arizona and Oregon, as well as get more from foundry partners. While the long-term purchase agreement have purchase agreements have provided more stability to make such investments. Microchip and others are hoping Congress approves a $52 billion funding package, which is expected to include grants to subsidize more U.S. chip production. Tech can't fix the problem of cars. The solution to problems caused partly by cars might not only be using different kinds of cars, but also remaking our world to rely on them less. Dr. Norden detailed decades of unfulfilled promises by car makers and tech companies that some invention was just around the corner to free us from the worst aspects of our car dependency. Dr. Norden told me that technologies were often half-baked, but the idea behind them was that anyone can drive anywhere at any time and park for free and there'd be no crashes. These technologies never delivered, and Dr. Norden said he doubted driverless cars would either. Driverless cars may encourage more miles on the road, which could make traffic and sprawl worse. The future of transportation needs to include more energy efficient and safe cars. Dr. Norden asked us to imagine what would happen if a fraction of the bonkers dollars spent to develop driverless cars were invested in unflashy products and policy changes. Can supersonic air travel fly again? In the 1960s aero test, booms reportedly broke windows, cracked plaster, and knocked knickknacks from shelves. In 1973, the Federal Aviation Administration forbade civilian supersonic air travel from flying over land. What we're doing is trying to spread those waves out and make them weaker. NASA's not alone in trying to reestablish supersonic travel. Blake Scholl, chief executive of the Denver-based company Boom Supersonic, has declared an audacious goal of delivering passengers anywhere in the world within 4 hours for $100. He said Boom would begin with international transoceanic supersonic service, so it would not have to worry about noise or wait for regulation changes, although domestic routes would mean more passengers, giving the business a huge boost, a factor of 2 or 3 times opportunity. He said, Mr. Scholl added that he thought that just making faster aircraft would not create a sustainable supersonic business. Planes must also be cheaper and eco-friendly. These engines, as well as modern materials, building methods, and efficiencies introduced since the 1970s supersonic vogue, would let Boom operate for 75% less than the Concorde, Mr. Scholl said, although he added his goal was to be about 95% less expensive. Do we know how much people are willing to pay, he added? We do our best analysis, but everything in the future could change. The best economists cannot find answers. Mr. Pilarski, an aviation economist and consultant, agreed that the numbers were uncertain, but still expects to see supersonic aircraft produced, although not by a major aircraft manufacturer. An environmental hero or outlaw? Can it be both? Finally, in 2011, an Ecuadorian court ruled in favor of Mr. Donziger's client and awarded them $18 billion. We have concluded we need to do more politically to control the court, to pressure the court, Mr. Donziger said in one especially damning clip. So Chevron turned the tables on Mr. Donziger and brought a RICO case against him in the United States. In a scorching 485-page decision, he wrote that Mr. Donziger had foisted fraudulent evidence on an Ecuadorian court and accused Mr. Donziger and his co-conspirators of attempting to use the court to extort money from Chevron. In 2018, after Judge Kaplan's judgment had finally been affirmed, the company brought another case against Mr. Donziger. Mr. Donziger refused to comply, saying it would give the oil company backdoor access to confidential attorney-client communications. In 2019, the judge took the extraordinary measure of bringing in a private law firm to prosecute Mr. Donziger for criminal contempt of court. In fate of oil field, climate activists and energy executives see future. In a few months, Cambo has become a bellwether for the oil industry and climate activists. Rejection of Cambo would actually say we are not serious about energy policy in the UK, said Mike Tholen, Director for Sustainability at Oil and Gas UK, an industry group. Cambo is an oil field discovered in 2002 in a region of the North Sea that has produced some of the largest finds in British waters in recent years. The field holds an estimated 800 million barrels, and Sycar Point said it would deliver 170 million barrels of oil and natural gas over a 25-year lifetime, making it relatively large field for Britain. Sycar Point said the project would send the equivalent of 134,000 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per year, equal to less than 1% of all emissions caused by producing oil and gas in Britain, the company said. Britain has embarked on a program to reduce these substantial emissions that oil and gas operations produce. Imported oil and gas wouldn't fall under those regulations. After climate-driven fires, finding a way to return home. From her rebuilt home, Miss Bolin now has a view of the canyon through which the fire tore into paradise. Decades later, these trails served as blueprints for modern roads, retaining their one-way in, one-way out gesture. Or in the presence of fires, said Dan FCF, district manager of Park District, one way in and no way out. The layout of the roads, unchanged since the earliest days, reflected the hands-off attitude that attracted many inhabitants to paradise. He'd seen homes employing fire-safe building codes catch fire, then act as fuel for the next home. Some people have already cashed out, tired of living under the constant threat of fire evacuations, said Jim Broshears, Paradise Emergency Operations Coordinator and former fire chief. If you can bring the fire to the ground, firefighters have a much better chance of being able to protect structures or establish control lines. If successful, the model can help people across the state stay in their communities. During last summer's fire evacuation, she said she was unfazed by the risk of losing her home again, adding, We've rebuilt our life once. We can do it again. Is carbon capture here? Each container holds 12 large round fans powered by renewable electricity from the geothermal plant, which sucked air into steel catchment boxes, where carbon dioxide, or CO2, the main greenhouse gas behind global warming, chemically bonds with a sand-like filtering substance. Even the CO2 that other firms are planning to inject into empty oil and gas fields could eventually leak out, some experts fear. But once carbon turns to rock, it's not going anywhere. Orca is billed as the world's first commercial DAC unit because of the 4,000 metric tons of CO2 it can extract each year, have been paid for by 8,000 the 4,000 tons have been paid for by 8,000 people who have subscribed online to remove some carbon, and by firms including Stripe, Swiss Re, Audi, and Microsoft. The problem is that Orca's output equals just 3 seconds of humanity's annual CO2 emissions, which are closer to 40 billion metric tons. But Orca has at least shown that the concept of scrubbing the air clean and putting carbon back underground has moved from science fiction to science. DAC's main output, helping to save the planet, must instead rely on government support such as emission credits and taxes on carbon emitters, hence the importance of meetings such as Glasgow COP. While Mr. Hitz and his team are monitoring Orca to home their next plant, which will be 10 times larger and is expected to launch in 2 to 3 years, Dr. Jebald acknowledged that in many ways Orca, meant to operate for a decade, has already achieved its goal. Dr. Grimson, the former president, is also downbeat about Glasgow, saying the problem is that GOP are primarily about finding ways to reduce emissions. That is fine, he said, but we also have to destroy some of the carbon that is already in the air. If we don't start doing that very, very quickly, we're never going to succeed on climate change. Oh shoot, this is the last one. How COVID raised the stakes of the war between faith and science. These past 2 years have exposed how the science versus faith discourse isn't an abstract ideological debate, but a false dichotomy that has disastrous real-world consequences. Nicholas Copernicus, Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and other giants of modern science were people of faith, A 2018 study by Barna, a Christian research and polling firm, showed that significantly fewer teens and young adults than Gen X and Boomers view science and faith as complementary. Young people increasingly see an essential conflict between faith and science. If the cultural conversation requires people to choose between faith and science, most will choose faith, but we don't have to ask people to choose. At the same time, Harsma said there are some Christians who present faith as opposed to evidence instead of faith as lived out commitment in response to evidence. That's a good way to put it. Faith is lived out commitment in response to evidence. Thank you, Harsma. And on those words, we are going to end Reading the Times for Monday, November 10th, 2021. My name is Shaz. SHAZZBARBARIC, SB Barrick, SHAZZBARBARIC. Years for the Revolution. Signing off.